Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this live stream. My name is Conan Kublik. I'm the pastor of New City Church in downtown Hamilton, Ontario, in Canada. I'm excited to host this evening on behalf of Noetic Shift, a partnership of churches that exists to thoughtfully and respectfully engage the culture of the greater Hamilton area from a distinctly Christian perspective and worldview. Noetic is a Greek word that has to do with knowing. It's about the mind and the intellect. This means that a noetic shift involves a change in thinking or a change in mind. We aim to create safe spaces where people from a variety of perspectives are free to discuss the important issues, assumptions, and realities about our world. Things such as origin, meaning, hope, and identity. Now, as we all know, the world is facing a serious pandemic at the moment. As relational beings, we have been forced to social distance, even while the coronavirus has significantly impacted our economy and changed how every one of us is living our daily lives. This deserves some thought and discussion around the important questions of where is God in a coronavirus world and how should we respond? Each of the 4 discussions in this series, including the one from last week, tackles these questions from a different angle. Noetic Shift is excited to partner in this series with Rabbi Zacharias International Ministries, an organization who, by helping the thinker believe and the believer think, is doing globally what we here at Noetic Shift are attempting to do locally. RZIM is a global team of speakers whose primary mission is to reach and challenge those who shape the ideas of a culture with the credibility of the gospel of Jesus Christ. In September 2018, Noetic Shift hosted Rabbi Zacharias and Sam Albury to a sold-out crowd of over 2,000 people at the First Ontario Concert Hall here in downtown Hamilton. Since then, we've hosted a variety of other events and are thankful for our partnership with RZIM Canada. RZIM was founded by Rabbi Zacharias, a Christian apologist and the author of more than 30 books on Christianity. He died of cancer on May 19th at his home in Atlanta at the age of 74. Last week, we screened a video honoring his life and ministry that is still available on our website. Tonight's RZIM speakers, Dr.Jo and Vince Vitale, will be speaking on love at arm's length, what social distancing teaches us about relationships. We'll have a Q&A after the presentation, but for internet safety, please do not include any personal information in either the chat or in the Ask a Question box at the bottom of the screen. Thank you. I'm so delighted that you can join us tonight for this very important series on where is God in the coronavirus. Let me introduce our speakers now for you tonight. Dr.Jo Vitale is Dean of Studies at the Zacharias Institute in Atlanta and an itinerant speaker for RZIM. During her time in Oxford, Jo graduated with a theology master's and an MST in biblical interpretation and a PhD in theology. She's slightly smart, that means. Each from the University of Oxford. Since joining RZIM, Jo has spoken internationally with a variety of contexts, and Jo also teams up weekly with her husband, Dr.Vince Vitale, for RZIM's Ask Away podcast. Although a UK national, Jo is based at the Zacharias Institute in Atlanta, Georgia, where she and Vince will live with their son, Raphael. I saw him a few minutes ago. He's incredibly cute, people. Jo's husband, Dr. Vince Vitale, is a speaker and author who serves at RZIM's regional director for the Americas and is the director of the Zacharias Institute. He was educated at Princeton University and the University of Oxford, and he taught philosophy of religion and served as a faculty member at both universities. It was during his undergraduate studies in philosophy at Princeton that Vince was challenged to read the Bible and took an unexpected journey from skeptic to evangelist. He then completed his master's and PhD studies at Oxford. Vince is an author with Rabbi Zacharias of 2 books, Why Suffering? Finding Meaning and Comfort When Life Doesn't Make Sense, and Jesus Among Secular Gods, the Countercultural Claims of Christ. Before I turn it over to Vince and Jo, I'd like to note for those watching that we do invite your questions tonight. Please write them in below, and Vince and Jo will take time to answer some of them after their talk. Again, for internet safety, please do not include any personal information in either the chat or in the Q&A. Thank you. Well, we're a few months into the pandemic now, and we're all feeling the effects of social distancing orders. What kind of impact does this have on our relationships? And what can we learn about relationships from this unique cultural moment? Let me turn this over to you now, Vince and Jo, to address this challenging topic, love at arm's length. Please welcome Vince and Jo Vitale.
Well, thank you so much. It really is a privilege to be partnering with you tonight. And good evening, everybody. We're delighted to be here with you. Our only sadness is that we can't actually be there with you in person and see your faces. And I'm sorry that you'll just have to settle for looking at ours instead. Although do be thankful, because it could be a lot worse. It's true, I still haven't had a haircut in 5 months, but Vince spent the first half of lockdown cultivating this kind of man of the woods look and letting his facial hair roam free for a while.
Yeah, Joe wasn't too impressed, and after a while we had to call a marriage compromise. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these. I wanted to keep the beard and Joe wanted me to shave it, and so we had a marriage compromise and I shaved. Funny how the marriage compromises always seem to work out that way. In so many ways, big and small, this has been a strange and challenging season for all of us, and not least in the lessons that we're learning about relating well to one another. Some people think that if Jesus were living today, this would have been the Last Supper. It would have been over Zoom, and I'm not sure exactly why there wasn't enough room for all of the apostles. It must have been an older version of Zoom. And people would cite even evidence from the Bible about this, because after Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to Mary and she recognized him, the first thing he says is, "Do not touch me." So there you have it. Jesus was a social distancer. He kept Mary at arm's length. And if that doesn't convince you, there's even a t-shirt and a hashtag, and there's really no arguing with that. Well, this topic of love at arm's length, it's not an abstract one for Joe and me. It's actually quite personal. My dad is a type 1 diabetic, and when the pandemic hit, he was about to have a major surgery. My brother's a nurse, and he told us straight up, he said, "Dad probably can't survive the coronavirus." And so we have largely stayed away. Sometimes you need to actually be away from those that you love for their good. At the very time that I wished to be with my dad most as he prepared for this surgery, I needed to distance myself from him, and that was precisely because of my love for him. That's a counterintuitive thought about relationships, but it's one that's been highlighted by this time of social distancing. If you're watching tonight and God seems distant to you, I wonder if something similar could be the case. Could it be the case that there seems to be distance, not because God doesn't love you or care for you, but precisely because he does?
We'll return to that specific question later. But in general, one significant impact of social distancing has been the way that it reveals to us in physical terms the spiritual reality of our relationships. The reality is we've been keeping people at arm's length long before COVID-19. And we're not just speaking metaphorically here. We literally keep people at arm's length when we walk onto a bus or into a cinema or up to a gate at an airport, and we survey where everybody else is sitting. What do? We instinctively walk to the seat which is the most isolated of all the remaining seats. Imagine if you walked onto a bus and just saw a few people on it, and rather than choosing your own row, you actually decided to sit down next to another human being. Imagine if you voluntarily decided to draw near to someone rather than socially distance from them. Now, I suspect that would go down about as well in Canada as it does in England. What does that instinct to steer clear of others say about the human species? What does that reveal about us?
C.S. Lewis commented on this tendency of humanity to distance ourselves from one another in The Great Divorce. And that novel begins in a dull, joyless town. It's intended to represent either hell or purgatory. It's called the Gray Town. And Lewis describes the behavior of the residents in this way. Let me read this to you. It's a few paragraphs. He says, "The trouble is that they're so quarrelsome. As soon as anyone arrives, he settles in some street. Before he's been there 24 hours, he quarrels with his neighbor. Before the week is over, he's quarreled so badly that he decides to move. You see, it's easy here. You've only got to think a house, and there it is. That's how the town keeps on growing, leaving more and more empty streets and people getting further and further apart. There's a bit of rising ground near where I live, and a chap has a telescope. You can see the lights of the inhabited houses millions of miles away, millions of miles from us and from one another. That's one of the disappointments. I thought you'd meet interesting historical characters when you get here, but you don't. They're too far away. What's the trouble about this place? Not that people are quarrelsome. That's only human nature and was the same even on earth. The trouble is they have no needs. You get everything you want by just imagining it. That's why it never causes any trouble to move to another street or build another house. In other words, there's no proper basis for any community life. If they needed real shops, chaps would have to stay near where the real shops were. If they needed real houses, they'd have to stay near where builders were. It's scarcity that enables a society to exist. And I think it's a prophetic passage for our time, especially in the developed world. All they have to do is imagine something and they have it. All we need to do is click a button on Amazon Prime and we have it. It just shows up at our doorstep. No need for real shops. We tend to blame technology for why each successive generation, you can see this statistically, is getting lonelier and lonelier. Why bother showing up at your college lecture if you can just stream it from your dorm room and never have to change out of your pajamas? Why walk into your local coffee shop and have to actually interact with another human person when you can just order it on the Starbucks app and pick it up at the drive-thru? If anything is to blame, surely it's the phone in our hands, it's the earbuds in our ears that have ripped us out of authentic community and into our own little virtual worlds. But social distancing, I think, has shown us that it's more complicated. Technology itself can't be the problem because now we're using the same exact technology that we blamed for our disconnection in order to find ways, like we're doing right now, to stay deeply connected and in real community. The problem is not technology. The problem is how we use it, and that's determined by what's in our hearts, even more than forcing us to live in a disconnected way. COVID-19 has forced us, I think, to see the trajectory that we were already on. Are we happy with that trajectory? Are we content to live in a gray town?
So let's ask the question, not just theoretically, but for each of us personally, how many feet do you put between yourself and other people? And we're not talking about physical feet, but more fundamentally, relationally, how close is close enough? How much of your real self are you willing to show? Perhaps one of the most disconcerting aspects of this season of lockdown for those of us who live with others is that some of us have come to the startling realization that the very people who we're supposed to be in closest relationship with, our family, our dearest friends or roommates, even our spouses, have somehow become the very people that we keep most at arm's length. It's easier to come home to others when you've got plenty of space from them during the day, when you can fill your hours with distractions. But once you're cooped up together, that forced proximity can reveal some awkward truths about the real state of our intimacy with those whom we claim to love best. Perhaps for some of you, the most painful experience of all through this last season has been the revelation that even within your household, you've got swept up in that same current, drifting a long way from each other and from where you first started out. Sure, when you lay your head down on the pillow at night, the physical space between you might be measured in inches, but relationally, that gap can stretch for miles. Are you truly known by anyone? That's a question worth not just hearing, but actually giving an answer to. If the answer is no, we're in real trouble, because the problem with not being known is that actually you can't be loved, because you can only love what you know. Let's take that question one step further still and ask ourselves whether we do the same with God. Looking back, can you identify a trajectory in your spiritual life which has resulted in you choosing to socially distance yourself from Him? Sure, you're happy to have a brief, superficial conversation across the aisle, but actually sitting next to each other, close enough for your arms to actually touch each other, that is weird. That's too close. That's too vulnerable. Maybe you call out a brief good night when you lay your head down on the pillow at the end of a long day. But when you wake up in the morning, is Jesus' face really the first thing that you want to see when you open your eyes? Or does that thought make you profoundly uncomfortable because you worry that if Jesus looked you straight in the eye, you know what He would see and you fear how He's going to react? Surely that kind of exposure is asking too much of us, to give up that much control, to demand that we trust God that much. And yet that is precisely the kind of relationship that God wants with each one of us, a relationship not measured by proximity, but by intimacy. At its core, Christianity is about an encounter with a God who is all-knowing and who, on account of his innately relational nature, is not only loving, but is love itself. What else is Christianity then, if not an invitation to be fully known and fully loved? That kind of intimacy is very scary, but it's absolutely worth it. Vince and I recently watched the movie The Green Book, and one line which particularly stood out to us was this: the world is full of lonely people afraid to make the first move. If nothing else, this season of social distancing has shown us where we're heading. The question is, now that we see it, will we change the trajectory of our relationships? Are we willing to make that first move?
In all of this, and this is where we've been headed, we can look to Jesus as our model. Jesus refused to put distance between himself and others. When he walked the earth, leprosy was a dreaded disease with no cure. And once people realized a person had leprosy, they were banished from society. They underwent mandatory social distancing. They could no longer sit and eat with their family or hug their children. They could only speak to them from distance. I mean, usually that would seem impossible to imagine. Now it seems strangely familiar. In public places, if people were approaching those who had leprosy, would have to shout out the warning, unclean, unclean, I'm unclean. And it's in that context that a man with leprosy came and knelt before Jesus. And he said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And Jesus, he could have just healed the man from a safe distance. But as the Gospel of Matthew records it, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said, be clean. And immediately that man was cleansed of his leprosy. Now, this doesn't mean that all of us should be touching those who are sick, but Jesus was a healthcare professional. He was a healer. And so it was appropriate for Jesus to do so. And it was so like Jesus to reach out for those whom everyone else had pushed aside.
Another time at a religious leader's home, in the midst of this upscale dinner party, a woman who is known around that city as a sinner heard that Jesus would be there. And so she showed up, and she was so overcome to be in his presence that she fell down at his feet and she began to weep. And as her tears fell on his feet, she wiped them with her hair, and then she kissed them and she poured perfume on them. Can you imagine that scene? She had broken all the norms of social distancing, and all the guests at the dinner party were judging Jesus for allowing it to happen, for associating with a woman whom the rest of society had cancelled. And Jesus allowed it for all to see. He was teaching the world a new way of loving, not love as a trophy for good behavior, but love as a gift. Not love that's meant to be earned, but simply to be returned. And people kept saying, Jesus, what are you doing? Why are you wasting your time on these lost causes? But the more reason Jesus had to stay away from someone, the greater his longing to draw near. As he said, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick.
All of this was part of an even more fundamental breach of social distance, the incarnation, when God came to live a human life in the person of Jesus. We tend to underestimate just how vast that distance that Jesus crossed to reach us really was, because often we can't see just how unclean we really are until we are standing in the presence of someone holier than ourselves. When Jo and I were dating, she decided to write me a list of 40 things that no one knew about Jo that she wanted me to know before we got engaged. It was a beautiful thing to do. Completely traumatizing, but beautiful. And so Jo talked me through this list, and we were doing pretty well. And then we got to number 27, and she turns to me and she says, and I quote, "Now, this one I'm really ashamed of. I feel I've really betrayed your trust here, and this may be the worst thing I've ever done to you." And now you can imagine, right? I'm trying to keep a calm expression. I'm trying to play it cool, but I'm freaking out inside. And you can imagine the things that are running through my head. She's cheated on me. She's only been pretending to be interested in learning about the New York Yankees, but she's actually a Blue Jays fan. She's a British spy and has to kill me because I know too much. I mean, these are the things. They're crazy things going through my head. And then Joe explains to me that there was this one time when we were getting to know each other, and we were already looking at old photos on my computer. And then when I left the room to go to the front door and answer the door, she simply continued looking through some of the pictures without me. At which point I started sweating, and I thought to myself, man, photo stalking? That's it? That's the worst thing you've ever done to me? I'm in so much trouble, I thought. She's so out of my league.
Actually, now that I think about it, you never gave me your list of 40 things.
Yeah, I wanted you to actually marry me. If I know that I can't come close to measuring up to Joe, how must I compare to a perfectly holy God? Think about that standard. Measured by that standard, every one of us, in a moral sense, in a spiritual sense, every one of us would look like a leper. And yet Jesus not only reached out and touched us, he became one of us. Metaphorically, he voluntarily became a leper and chose to live among lepers so that lepers would not be alone and unloved. Can you think of anyone who would do such a thing? No. Because there's only one person in the universe who loves that extravagantly. And that's personally why I choose to follow him. In very significant ways, Jesus rejected social distance, and he drew as near as he possibly could to every single person. And yet, there are also some ways in which Jesus did keep relationships at arm's length. If we think of the incarnation from the opposite direction, if we turn it around, yes, the incarnation bridges the social distance between us and God, but that very same act, it also creates social distance between Jesus and his heavenly Father. To come and heal us, Jesus had to distance himself from his own Father. When COVID-19 became a pandemic, my brother Jay and his wife, they had just had a baby. But my brother is an emergency room nurse in New Jersey. And so he had a really difficult decision to make. He worked per diem, which means he wasn't required to go back to work. He wouldn't have lost his job if he didn't go back to work. And he was in a financially stable position. And he knew that if he went back to work and was so heavily exposed to the virus in the hospital, then he couldn't spend time with my dad, given my dad's diabetes and his approaching surgery. And even worse, that meant my dad wasn't going to be able to spend time with his new grandson. And yet, despite the relational cost, Jay went back to work. He chose to keep family at arm's length in order to go back to the hospital to save the lives of complete strangers, people he had never met.
The question is, why would Jay choose to do that? When the pandemic was first growing in North America, I saw a photo online of someone holding up a sign that read, "Sacrifice the weak." And we intuitively recoil at that statement. But why? After all, if we're just evolutionary byproducts and the fundamental guiding principle of reality is survival of the fittest, then what's wrong with sacrificing the weak? Isn't that just a sensible biological proposition? Isn't that just the flip side of the same naturalistic coin, survival of the fittest on the one side and the killing of the weakest on the other? So where then does this intuition come from that each life is sacred, that each life is worth sacrificing for, that each life is equally valuable?
Because for all people to have equal value, there has to be something that is equally true of every single human person. For everyone to be equally valuable, there has to be something which is equally true of everyone. What is it? What is the thing that is equally true of every single one of us and that can never change? And it's surprisingly difficult to answer that question because all of our natural endowments, they're all distributed along a spectrum. Some people are less intelligent than others, less happy than others, less healthy, less wealthy, less useful for society, less good looking, less capable of passing on their genes. And all of these things, they all change over time. So what is equally true of every single person and completely unchanging and therefore can ground the equal value of every single person? As far as I can tell, only one thing: the love of God, the extravagant, unconditional, no ifs love of the Christian God that is for every single person and that cannot be earned and cannot be lost. Early in our dating relationship, Jo at one point was a bit blinded by love, and she turned to me and she said, Vince, I don't deserve you. And I said, no, you don't. Which is not the recommended response. But thankfully, I didn't stop there. I said, no, you don't. And I don't deserve you either. Isn't it wonderful? Love at its best is not about what we earn or merit or deserve. It is based on grace, unmerited love. That's why when we got married, we pledged for better or for worse. I was saying I would rather be worse off with Jo than better off without her.
Hey.
I'm not saying that I am. I'm just saying that if I were, I would still rather that. It's really, if you think that through, it's really an incredible promise to make. It's absolutely radical that we're in this. I'm in this regardless of whether it's good for me, regardless of whether it winds up to my personal benefit. And that is the type of promise that God makes to us. He will love us no matter what, without condition. And I like that type of love. It's the sort of love that means you don't always have to be looking over your shoulder or around the corner worrying if someone more worthy of love than you is going to come along. It's a love that is secure, and therefore a love that you can stop competing for and just enjoy. That we are loved by God is the one and only thing about you and me that could never change. That's why I believe only God can give us our identity, and that's why only God can ground the equal value of every single person, which is at the foundation of any plausible morality. If the fundamental principle of reality is that type of love, a God who, despite being the fittest and the strongest, sacrificed himself for the weakest, if that's true, then when my brother went back to work, he wasn't being foolish. No, he was aligning himself with the truth about reality, and he was loving like the God who is the ground of all truth and who created each person in his image and therefore endows each and every person with infinite and inviolable worth. Jesus was willing to distance himself from family and from safety to be close to us, even though it was worse for him, even though we could not offer him anything in return. Therefore, you can know that whenever you feel weak, God won't sacrifice you. He sacrificed himself instead.
Let's take a look at a second reason why Jesus sometimes temporarily distanced himself from others, to get time alone in prayer with his Father and for the specific purpose of setting the trajectory for the rest of life. One time he even withdrew to the desert for 40 days without his normal community and routines and resources. We're told then that the devil tempted him 3 times, tempted him to live for comfort, for power, and for money. But each time, quoting from scripture, Jesus responded, no. Life is about more than that. I'm not going to settle for those things when I know deep in my heart that God has so much more for me. What about you? What have you resolved to live for? We tell ourselves that we have plenty of time left to make those kind of big decisions, but the years have a way of slipping away from us, in part because most of us are so scared to confront our own mortality that we dedicate our lives to distraction. In the words of the philosopher Blaise Pascal, all of humanity's problems boil down to not being able to sit quietly in a room alone. But then every so often, unavoidable tragedies occur. Events like a global pandemic, which shake us from our flimsy evasions and force us into isolation to confront the very thing that we've been running away from, our own selves. One piercing question that COVID-19 has been asking every one of us right now in a very powerful way is the question of whether we're going to live for our own comfort or for others' needs. And it's not that it's a different question than usual, it's just starker now. We answer this question every day, actually, by the way that we live, what we buy, how we spend our money, how we treat people. Confronted in the desert, Jesus refused to buy into the temptation of what his life could be if he centered it on himself. What about us? In this season of self-isolation, what has been revealed to us about the trajectory that we are on? Will we continue to keep others at arm's length as we devote our lives to the singular goal of building our own kingdoms? Or will our prayer be, your kingdom come, your will be done.
Let's look at one more instance of Jesus keeping someone at arm's length. This one, quite literal. We'll go back to Jesus telling Mary not to touch him. Jesus' friend, Mary Magdalene, had gone to Jesus' tomb on the Sunday morning after his crucifixion, and she's crying, and there's someone there who she thinks is the gardener. All of a sudden, he says, Mary. He calls her by name, and immediately she knows it's Jesus. She turns towards him, and she cries out, "Teacher." And then Jesus says, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father." And we joked about it earlier, but it's fair to ask, what's going on here? Mary thought Jesus was dead, and now he's alive, and she's completely overjoyed, and she just wants to hold him. And Jesus is the one who's always welcoming everyone, the lepers, the tax collectors, the outcasts. He's letting everyone approach him and cry on him and even wipe his feet with their hair. So why would Jesus, of all people, say, "Don't hold on to me, and I need to go"? Remember, I needed to be away from my dad during this pandemic for his own good because of my love and care for him. Why might it be good for us, for Jesus to go?
Many people assume if God really cared, if we believe in him, then he'd make himself more obvious. Bertrand Russell was one of these people, one of the 20th century's most intellectually accomplished atheists. And he was once asked what he would say to God if it turned out that he was wrong. And after death, he found himself standing before him. And Russell famously responded, "Not enough evidence, God, not enough evidence." But you can't just say, "Not enough evidence." You need to ask, "Not enough evidence for what?" What is God after? You can't judge God's methods until you identify his aims. See, if God just wants us to intellectually believe in him, then sure, he could appear in the sky in a terrifying blaze of glory, or he could write the Greek New Testament on every atom in the universe for us to find under a microscope, and that would be pretty cool. But we would basically be forced to believe, and mere intellectual belief is not God's aim.
We know that because the Bible says that even the demons have intellectual belief and they shudder. It does them no good. But what if instead what God desires with us is not just intellectual belief, but relationship, trust, intimacy? Those things cannot be forced. They have to be pursued. They have to be developed over time, and they have to be based on loving a person's character, not merely fearing their power. I think the Christian philosopher Blaise Pascal put this best in the 17th century. Just listen carefully to his words. This is what he has to say. He said, "Willing to appear openly to those who seek him with all their heart, and to be hidden from those who flee from him with all their heart. God regulates the knowledge of himself such that he has given signs of himself which are visible to those who seek him and not to those who do not seek him. There is enough light for those who only desire to see, and enough obscurity for those who have a contrary disposition."
And when Ravi Zacharias, who founded the organization that we work for, was 17 years old, a Bible was brought to him on a bed of suicide. He had swallowed poison because he didn't believe that his life had meaning and purpose. And as the Bible was handed to him in his hospital bed, his mother read these words of Jesus to him from the Gospel of John: "Because I live, you also shall live." And as Ravi heard those words, they pierced his heart. He had an encounter with God, but there also needed to be a pursuit. Right there, lying on that hospital bed, Ravi said to God, "God, if you are speaking to me, then I will leave no stone unturned in my pursuit of truth." See, Ravi truly desired to see all that God wanted to reveal to him, and that set the trajectory for his entire life. In one of the last conversations that we had with Ravi, as he was dying of cancer, he said, "I only gave myself 17 years. God gave me 57 more, and on into eternity. I have nothing but gratitude." Do you know that kind of contentment? Contentment in life, contentment through all of life's twists and turns, even contentment in death. Contrary to how it may sometimes have felt during this season, the Bible promises us that God is not far away from any one of us. The question is, are you still trying to keep him comfortably at arm's length, or are you willing to leave no stone unturned in your pursuit of God so that you too will be in a position to see all that he desires to show you?
One of the most heart-wrenching articles I've read on the coronavirus was a USA Today article, and it was entitled, "We Hear You, Dad." There was a woman named Abby whose dad was dying in the hospital from COVID-19, and she couldn't go to see him. He couldn't speak anymore, but he could hear, and so the nurses carefully positioned a phone so that Abby and her siblings could speak to him, and they spent the next 36 hours on the phone listening to their father die, praying that he could hear their voices. And Abby remembers saying into the phone, "I love you, thank you, I'm sorry, breathe, Dad, we need to hear you breathe," she would say. And sometimes many seconds would pass in between breaths. And then when a breath would finally come, Abby would say, "We hear you, Dad, we hear you." And as I was reading this article, it brought me to the end of Jesus's life. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. That's in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 15. God the Father heard Jesus's last breath from distance. His son was dying, and he couldn't be there the way he longed to be. Over hours, as Jesus hung there dying, his Father listened to every breath, and he heard the breaths getting more and more difficult until he heard that deafening silence when another breath never came. He did that for us. He was willing to go through that social distance in order to bridge the distance between us and him. That is how much he loves us. That is how much he desires relationship with each one of us. And because he really does understand what we are going through right now, because he lived it, that's why I think he is the one we can turn to right now with our fears, with our grief, as we chart a course for the future of our relationships, and certainly with our questions. And we're eager to hear your questions and respond to them. Thank you so much for giving us a hearing, and we'll turn back over to Conan.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate, especially just the thought that, Jesus was willing to face that distance between the Father and himself, to bridge the distance between us and the Father. It's really helpful. As they said, we're now going to take some time for questions and for answers. Again, if you've not already done so, please type in your questions below. And to moderate the Q&A tonight, we've got Logan Gates. Logan Gates is an itinerant speaker with RZIM Canada, and he earned a master's degree in theology at the University of Oxford, and he's currently pursuing a PhD in political theory at the University of Toronto. Logan's passion is to help others encounter God by exploring the big questions in life. Logan also speaks Spanish and French, and he lives in Toronto, where he loves to surf, drink tea, and cook with his wife, Samantha. Let me turn it over to you, Logan.
Great. Thank you, Conan, and thank you, Vince and Joe. Well, as you can maybe see, Vince and Joe, there are 10 questions that have come in, and I imagine more will be coming. We're not going to probably be able to get to all the questions tonight, but we're going to try to prioritize the questions that are related to the topic. So again, the topic is love at arm's length, what social distancing teaches us about relationships. But of course, feel free to ask as well on topics that Vince and Joe have touched on. But thanks again, Vince and Joe, and I'm excited just to lead us off with one question that's come in that I think is particularly poignant. And this comes from Kira, if I'm saying that right, it's Kira. And the question is just, can you explain why God, who you say is loving, would allow coronavirus? It feels very unloving. What would you guys say to that to start us off tonight?
Well, and that was from Kira, Logan?
Yes, I think so.
Great. And good to see you, brother, as well. Kira, thanks for diving right in and putting that right on the table, because it's hard to speak to anything in this season if we don't speak to this question first. So it's a very honest question, and it's exactly the question we should be starting with. And unfortunately, there's no easy answer. So we'll take a few minutes to open this up just a bit, but I want you to know, even as we get started, that we are perfectly aware of the fact that we will not be giving you a full and exhaustive answer to this question. And I know that if you wanted to discuss this more, you can always write in to the team. We would be very happy to discuss it further, as would other members of our team as well. But sort of viscerally, where I go when you ask that question is to a relatively recent experience when we had to take our son, Raphael, to the doctor. And at one point they had to do some tests on his heart. And in order to do so, he had to have like 10 wires hooked up to his chest with these stickers on his chest. And at that time he was under a year old. And so he certainly couldn't understand what was going on or why it was going on. And worse than that, my job as his father was to hold him down in place as these tests were performed on him that were uncomfortable or even painful. And I was crying worse than he was. But it struck me in that moment, looking at my young, small son, that we're in something like that position with respect to God. We can't, by the nature of how small we are and how young we are relative to God's level of understanding, always know why he might allow some of the things that he allows. And the incredible thing about that experience is that I was allowing this, I was even involved in it in some way, not because I didn't care for my son, but precisely because I did care for my son. And that would have been completely inconceivable to him. And yet there was truth in that. And so if Jesus has shown that he is who he claimed to be, if he has shown that through his resurrection, if he's given us reason to believe that he was really a divine person who was willing to sacrifice his life for us, and we can trust his goodness because of that, then sometimes we do need to be willing to live with the fact that we're not going to have a full understanding when it comes to some of his ways. That said, there are some interesting things for us to continue to reflect on. You know, I have been reflecting in this season about the brokenness of the world, according to the Christian faith. Natural disasters of many sorts, from diseases to earthquakes to tornadoes, they're not intrinsically evil in and of themselves. If you watch a tornado from a safe distance, it can be majestic and a beautiful piece of creation. If you look at a virus under a microscope, there is an elegance and a beauty to it. These things are bad when they impact people in ways that I believe that they're not intended to. If we didn't have viruses at all, bacteria would multiply so quickly and so quickly cover the entire earth that nothing could inhabit the earth, including you and me. So there's this delicate balance to the design of the earth. And part of the Christian story is that we're living in a stage of history where that balance has been broken in some way. And so what we're experiencing is not us functioning in the environment in the way that maybe we were intended to function in the environment. And if you think about a feral child, a child that is supposed to be in a certain environment, but is actually taken out of relationship with the child's parents and with all community, what happens is that the child is no longer able to function properly and in a healthy manner in the context of the environment that the child is in. Could something like that be the case with humanity as a whole? We have willfully taken ourselves out of relationship with the person we're supposed to be in closest relationship with, and who's supposed to guide our steps step by step, God himself. We're living outside of the relationship that we are supposed to be, is supposed to be most significant in our life. And could it be, therefore, that we're interacting with our environment in a way that is broken? One day, I think that won't be the case. And we have that promise within the scriptures that one day there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. And there's a beautiful detail in that passage which says, because God himself will wipe away the tears. That's not just metaphor. Jesus has risen in a physical body. He's a physical person as we are. And one day I believe he will physically put his hands on our faces and wipe away the tears. And so I believe, because of who Jesus showed he was, the fact that he sacrificed himself for us, we have great reason to trust him. I don't think that our expectation should be that we will always understand, but I do believe we can trust the promise as we look forward to a time where there'll be suffering no more. That's a hope that I have within my Christian faith. I'm not sure that when you turn to other worldviews such as atheism, that you find that hope or have reason to trust in it. But I believe we do have that in the Christian faith, and so I commend it to you. Thanks a lot for that question.
just to say, because Vince probably wouldn't, but this is the area that he wrote his PhD on, and does have a book with Ravi on the topic of why suffering, finding meaning and comfort when life doesn't make sense. So if you want to, there's so much to this question, and if you want to take a deeper dive into it, please do check that out. But one thing Vince will sometimes talk about is the difference between goodness explained and goodness displayed. And I think the really hard thing about a pandemic like this is we don't get the explanations. We don't get to know why this pandemic right now, why is this happening? Some of you may have lost family members, and you're thinking, God, why would you take this person away from me? And we don't always get the specific answer to that question. We don't get it explained for us, but we do see goodness displayed because, as Vince has been talking about, we see the love of a God who is for us radically shown in the person of Jesus. And we ourselves had a miscarriage last year and lost a child, and the devastation of that, of not knowing why our child, why did this happen? And yet at the same time, what comfort it is to me that to know that out of everybody, God knows how that feels. He himself knows what it's like to lose his son, to watch his son die. And actually, they went through that for us. Jesus voluntarily went through that for us because that's how much he loves us. So we may not always get the why explanations for why a pandemic, why this virus, why on this scale, but we do know there is a God who loves us so much that he has done everything to ensure that there will be redemption, that there will be healing, there will be that hope that Vince has spoken of. And I can remember the day that I miscarried, actually. Vince and I had already decided to call our child Luca, whether it was a boy or girl, because Luca means light. But we hadn't told anybody the name of the child. And the day that, just a few hours before I started miscarrying, a friend who I work with said, "Jo, can I just pray for you?" And then as she was praying, the words that she spoke over me were, she said, "Jo, God has put a light in you, and that light is never going to stop shining." And I was just blown away that of all the words she could have used, those were the words that she chose. And as she said it, I just knew with this core conviction within me that was true, that Luca, her light or his light would never, ever go out. Why? Because Jesus is the light of the world who stepped into the darkness. And even though the darkness surrounded him the way it's been surrounding us for so long, the darkness could not overcome him. And therefore we can trust that even in the midst of our pain, there is a way out so that it doesn't need to overcome us either.
And just real quick, Logan, amazingly, end of that story, Jo's pregnant right now. We're due September 20th with a baby who never could have existed had Luca gone to full term, because this pregnancy started when Luca still would have been in the womb. So that's just one more example of, we genuinely believe that one day we are going to be in eternity with both of those children, one of whom could not have existed had we not lost the first. We never could have conceived of that or thought of that at the time. But sometimes when we live with God over time and we trust him that he is big enough and powerful enough and loving enough to resolve the narrative in the end, over time we see more of the explanation than we might have in the first instance.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much for being so vulnerable and honest. We understand that it's one thing to even share that kind of thing in front of a group of people, but to do that even virtually, I think we just feel your heart and your pain that comes out in a real way as you wrestle with this question, but also finds hope in Jesus and what he's done. And I just think there's a great question to follow up on this that I think relates to how we walk alongside those who are going through similar dark times, like the ones that you all have been sharing very openly about. So this is a question from Cham. Cham asks, how to explain that God is near and not far, and a loving God who's alive to those who lost their jobs because of this pandemic, those who have lost their loved ones without having a decent burial because of physical distancing, and most especially to the poor who have limited access to food and social media, unlike the rich. So a very practical question on what does it look like? What do you say to someone, who you can tell they're going through a dark valley? How do you express if you're a Christian, what hope there is there?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I was just going to say, and please jump in, Jo, but I take that, Cham, thank you, as a very important question from you, and also a really personal challenge to me as a follower of Jesus. when Jesus says that the community that he came to build, which we call the church, he refers to that as his body. The scriptures refer to that as the body of Christ, and talk about Christians as being ambassadors that Jesus is acting through. We so often don't live up to that in the way that we're intended to. And so the first thing that comes to mind for me as you ask those questions, and I think about friends and family in my own life who've experienced some of those experiences, I take that as a personal challenge. You know, have I been there in such a way? Jesus says, what you have done for one of the least, you have done for me. He makes this really strong connection, both between us being his body and him acting through us, and also when we care for those who are going through distress and are among the least in whatever respect, that is actually our worship to him, and it is the way we treat him. So these relationships are supposed to be intertwined, and we're supposed to see that consistency in the way that a Christian is treating someone who has had depression or lost something, or lost their job, or lost a family member. And if you can look to someone who's supposed to be a part of the body of Christ and say, that person is acting the way that I would hope that a loving God would act towards me, then sometimes that's the open door to begin a conversation with God, where we begin to express our honest emotions, including our frustration and our anger towards him. And I would encourage you, I've been lingering during this season. And like I said, you know, we've had some family connections in terms of what's going on in the pandemic, which have been quite serious. And I've been lingering in the Psalms, and the Psalms are songs that are written to God. And very often, especially in the Psalms that are called laments, they start with just the emotions of frustration and anger. And so often, I mean, your question could literally be a paraphrase of about 20 or 25 of these Psalms. They're saying, where are you, God? How can I believe that you're near? And it is in particular in the context of pouring out those emotions to God that often you see in the context of these songs being written over time in community. It's not just a magical fix. In the context of conversation in relationship, we see someone's heart begin to turn, and in conversation sense that they're not the only one speaking, but that God is speaking back to them. And we sense that oftentimes when we pray, we sense that through the way other people who follow Christ might be interacting with us. And we sense that through the Bible, where God actually left us words himself, so that someone like our founder and dear friend Ravi Zacharias could be lying on a bed of suicide and be brought a Bible, and the chapter and verse that was given to his mother to read to him was, because I live, you also will live. And in that hearing of God's voice to him, those words spoken directly to him, literally right then his entire life began to change and moved in a direction where it was headed towards death, and now it was headed towards life. So this is not just you put a coin in a slot machine and get something out. It's not that way, precisely because God wants our nearness with him and our experience of his nearness with us to not just be flipping a switch. He wants it to be a developed relationship over time, because he wants it to be genuine intimacy and long-lasting intimacy. Sometimes that makes it frustrating, just like with any relationship, where so often you're frustrated by a relationship. You just want it to be a different way. Why can't you just... But any good and meaningful relationship in your life does take time. It does take commitment, and it certainly takes good communication. So that would be the place that I would start as you wrestle with this really good question.
Yeah, that's quite the challenge for us to live up to, because actually one of the reasons that the early church expanded so rapidly in the ancient world was because at that time when there were, first with leprosy and then extreme plagues, when other people would abandon those who were sick and dying, it was the Christians who would stay with them. And that's partly why the church grew so much, because the people said, those who survived and came through it said, well, if that's what people are willing to lay down for me, then there must be truly something radically different about this religion than I've understood. And if they love like that, that's something that I want to be a part of. And what a great challenge for us at a time when so many people have actually been hurt by the church. Maybe they've walked away from faith precisely because of their experience of Christians, or what they understand Christians to always stand against. This is a chance to show what we stand for. And just one final comment here as well is that sometimes Christians talk so much about Jesus that I think you can feel like, well, but he came then, but he's not here now. And so you say God is close, but I'm not experiencing him as close at all. But actually, what's so amazing about when Jesus leaves, he actually says, it's better that I go, because I'm going to send the Holy Spirit to be with you. Now, who's the Holy Spirit? It's basically the presence of Jesus who comes to live within every single one of us. So rather than Jesus being out of reach and far away, God is closer than ever. When you become a Christian, God is literally dwelling within you. And, we already mentioned it earlier, but the Bible does promise that God is not far from every one of us. And so if you're somebody who's struggling in this season and wondering, where is God? And why can't I see him and touch him and into even closer to, I would just encourage you to ask him to make himself present to you. Vince and I always encourage people, even if you've never prayed before, to try something called an agnostic's prayer, just to say, God, I don't know if you're real, but if you are, I would really like to know about it. I would really like to encounter you. I would really like to experience you, particularly in this season of hardship. I really want to know if there's someone out there who loves me. So would you make yourself real to me if you're truly there? I believe that is a prayer that actually God loves to answer. So I encourage you to give it a go, because I really believe he isn't far from any of us.
That's so helpful, Vincent, Jo. It reminds me of the film Interstellar, which has a lot to do with distance between a child and a father, and the child grows up and her father's not around, and anyhow, it's got space travel in it and that sort of thing. But there comes this moment, the director is not a Christian by any means, but towards the end of the movie, she realizes, as she's thinking through where her father has been, that her father actually has never left. And there's this sense in which love, through this science fiction movie, stretches across even dimensions of time and space. And that's such a sobering, moving moment when she realizes this felt experience of God being, or her father being far. Actually, in the end, if she just knew the reality that was there, was that her father had never left her all along. I think that moves us so much, perhaps because it's an echo of something deeper that the Christian faith claims. God might not feel close in the moments, but I think he's telling us, I have never left you, even if we don't always feel that way. Well, I just think these questions you've talked about playing into, especially the role of the church, I think is such a great segue to a question we have here from Tara, but others have come in on a similar line. But Tara asks, how should we draw close to people in order to love them the way Jesus tells us to love, while at the same time maintaining healthy boundaries? And just to up the ante on this, Vince, you've talked about your father, being, having a precondition that makes him more vulnerable. And we know that many of us have people in our lives like that as well. Couldn't we think that when hopefully you'll see you're going to want to see your father at some point, but won't there always be some degree of risk there? Mm-hmm. And even what Jo has touched on about Christians, shouldn't we be out? It seems that's what Christians maybe did in previous pandemics. And yet it seems perhaps that the right response is just to hold back. But in a way, both of you mentioned this idea of comfort, that we don't want to retreat into comfort. So anyhow, all that, I'll just throw all that out there for you guys. But, what does it look like for us to proactively love, even in the midst of this virus being in the background and these protocols of physical distancing?
Yeah. Thanks for making the question that much more challenging before throwing it to us. What kind of colleague are you?
Anytime.
Yeah. And I think maybe one of the things that's been uniquely challenging about this pandemic is actually because your instinct is always to get physically close, isn't it? If your love language is physical affection, to not be able to give someone a hug when they really need it, to not be there physically caring for them, it feels awful. But at the same time, the irony is that whatever action you're taking, whether it's to draw close to someone or it's to step away, I think the point we're trying to make tonight and is that in every sense, a Christian should be guided by the ethic of love, by the ethic of what is best for this person, but also for any other vulnerable people that I might be coming across. So the strange irony of social distancing is actually in this season for the church. The reason why, so many churches have closed and we've stepped away, it is not because we don't care, but actually that has been out of love. That's been out of a desire to say, selfishly, I would want to be near you right now. But I know that if I come close, I risk bringing infection to you, or if you have infection, taking it to other vulnerable people. So the irony here is sometimes the loving thing is to socially distance. But that doesn't mean that you can't show love. And I think one of the wonderful things that we've all, I think, been experiencing in this season is how much you can do through technology. Technology sometimes gets a really bad rap, doesn't it? Look what we're doing tonight that wouldn't be possible without it. And so there are ways to draw nearer to each other, and perhaps even unique ways that God can use that. We've certainly experienced, even as part of our team, that actually some of our times of prayer together have felt even more intimate and vulnerable and personal over Zoom than they sometimes do when you're physically there in the office together. Maybe there's something about having to look someone right in the face when you're talking to them. You feel closer in some ways, but also there's a sense in which when you're going through something so hard that it's communally shared all the way across the world, I think that sense of solidarity brings you together as well. So I think it's just looking for what are the things that you can do, things that don't spread infection, but you can still practically serve. So many churches have been doing amazing things like bringing food to people for those who actually can't step outside the house, for organizing it to be delivered to them. There are practical ways that we can help each other, but also I think we've seen the church do some really amazing things in this season in terms of the amount they've moved online and how ready they've been to do that. Now, it might not always be the highest production value, but it's about reaching out to people. It was interesting to me that actually in the UK, 1 in 5 people in their 20s and 30s who've never been inside a church have actually watched a service online in the last couple of months.
Wow.
Because it's these kind of, when you go through something as hard, it stirs up deep questions about life and purpose, and is there anyone out there who cares? So I think the question would be, what can you do that is guided by the ethic of love, that follows in the way of Jesus, that is willing to make hard sacrifices, but maybe the sacrifice you're being asked to make, if you're not a healthcare professional or someone who can't physically serve in certain ways, maybe the sacrifice is not being with people, but the sacrifice is to not be with them. And that is a hard thing for all of us, to not be selfish when we want to get out and we want to just be free and be in the streets, but actually we're choosing to put other people's health and their needs before our own.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up briefly on what you said, Logan, that there will always be some level of risk. And it just reminded me of this New York Times article that I read by Elaine de Botton. He was reflecting on Camus' views on philosophy. And the quote that really stuck in my mind was, it said, "Life is a hospice, never a hospital." And actually, I pulled up the quote while Joe was speaking, and this is what de Botton said. He said, "Plague or no plague, there is always, as it were, the plague. If what we mean by that is a susceptibility to sudden death, an event that can render our lives instantaneously meaningless." Now, as a Christian, I have the hope that death does not render our lives meaningless. It's actually an entry point into the fullness of life. But there is this reality. Part of what we should be thinking through this time is about the fact that it's not as unique of a time as we think it is. Because even as we step out of a pandemic, it's still going to be the case that life is a hospice, not a hospital. And any moment we could be faced with death. And I go back to Abby's words when she couldn't be with her dad. And it's very interesting to me what those words were that she said kept coming out of her mouth on the phone. Thank you. I love you. I'm sorry. 3 sentences that we don't say frequently enough. And it was so obvious to her that those were the words that should be coming out of her mouth towards her dad when she knew he was dying. But the reality is we're all dying. Are we saying those words as frequently as we would like? And the reality is that most people in the world have never had someone ask them for forgiveness. They've never actually experienced the sort of reconciliation that is right at the center and the heart of the Christian faith. That's what we believe we do with God. At some point, we come to a conviction that we fall short of Him, and that there's a distance that needs to be bridged in order for us to be in relationship with Him. And we go to Him and we say, "I'm imperfect. I've done wrong. Will you forgive me?" And then there's a peace that comes as we sense His love responding to that. What better way to spend this time than to think about, is there someone that I need to ask for forgiveness from? Could I give someone an example of what that would look like to ask for forgiveness from God, because they actually don't just hear me talking about it abstractly, propositionally, philosophically, but because I actually go to them and do it, and someone has a real, concrete, tangible experience of reconciliation, which is exactly what we're talking about when we talk about the good news of the Christian faith. So yes, we're in a pandemic, but in some ways we're always in the plague. What are the words that are consistently coming out of our mouth? Are they the words that point to what's most meaningful in life and to what's most meaningful in our faith as well, not just in an abstract way, but a very concrete way?
Thanks so much, Vincent, Jo. I think that's very provocative to think of, in a way, this space and the more intentionality required to have these conversations actually can lead us to think through what are some of the more meaningful, deeper, harder maybe conversations, but the better ones that this season could be a season in which we have that idea.
So that's good. You put it better than we did. That was well said. What he said.
Well, guys, this time has been flying by. It's been wonderful. Maybe you have your eyes on that number down there. 14 questions still submitted, and people are continuing to vote. But I'd love to just end with this question, which is, again, another poignant one. We've gone deep all through this time. Thanks, Vincent, Jo, for journeying with us. But this question is from Ariel. And Ariel asks, if Jesus didn't have any mental illnesses, then how does he know my pain? So much of what you've talked about is talked about God sharing our suffering and pain through Jesus, through the incarnation. But can Jesus identify with us at that level at the level of mental illness? What would you all say to that? And I'll leave it for you all to close the night with any concluding remarks you have.
Maybe I'll start and
Sure.
Conclude. Thank you, Ariel, for being vulnerable with your question. And I'm really sorry that is something that you're dealing with. I also know that you're not alone. I know that is a profound struggle that many of us experience. And if we haven't, we may well at some point in life. This is the world we're in. And one thing I appreciate about it is that these days people do feel the greater freedom to talk about these things. I think it's really important that we do as a church, that we don't bury our struggles, but we allow one another to walk through them together. And I hope that there are people in your life who are helping you walk through this and helping carry those burdens. I also want to say that actually that there are examples of people in the Bible who it seems also struggle with these kind of mental illnesses and challenges. Elijah may well be one of them in the Old Testament. He's a prophet who has like the greatest day of his life in one sense, like the pinnacle of his prophetic ministry. And then the next day you'd think he'd be feeling great, but he's so depressed that he's suicidal, and he just lies down and says, I just want to die in this moment. I don't want to go on. This feels so pointless. Why am I even here? Why am I even bothering? And I've always been really moved by God's response actually to Elijah in that moment, because he doesn't just say like, cheer up, or he doesn't just kind of sweep it all away. But the first thing he does is he helps him fall asleep, because he knows what his physical need is. He gives him some cake, which I personally appreciate. He's meeting his physical needs first. And I think that's important for us to address as well, that sometimes there are physical needs that come with mental illnesses, that it's right that we pursue those things, that we don't just treat it as an emotional problem when it may well be a chemical one, that we respond with the physical need. But then God also encounters Elijah after that. He has this deep, intimate moment with him where he shows up. And he lets them know, I'm here with you. And I think it's crucial for us to understand that. I spoke a little bit earlier about the fact that the beautiful thing about Jesus ascending and being with God is that he left his Holy Spirit with us, that actually God is present with you. So even if it, is the case that Jesus himself didn't struggle with mental illness, then it doesn't change the fact that God is present with you. God sees and knows and experiences what you're going through because he's present in a way that actually nobody else can. No one else can know what it's like to be you. No one else can know what you're walking through. But there's an all-powerful, all-loving God who pays attention to you. The Bible talks about the eyes of the Lord ranging throughout all the earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him. The point being, God is paying attention. You may feel invisible and unseen, but God actually sees you. He knows your pain intimately in that sense, and you are never alone in it. And even if Jesus perhaps didn't experience, it's hard, isn't it? There are so many different forms of mental anxiety and illness. How do we even know how to categorize them? How do we even know what Jesus did or didn't struggle with? What we do know about Jesus is that actually he wasn't just fully God, but he's fully human, and he becomes that way so that he can sympathize with us in all of our weaknesses. The Bible talks about it that way. But one thing that we do see of Jesus is extreme mental anguish. The night before Jesus died, when he's facing what is coming the next day, we're told that he's so overwhelmed with sorrow that he says he's overwhelmed even unto death. That actually he's so overcome that he's sweating tears of blood, and he's begging God to take this away from him. But there's clearly some kind of deep mental anguish that Jesus himself experienced in that moment, and I take comfort from that, because I think it means that whatever it is that we might be going through, however dark things may seem, whatever anxiety or depression you're struggling with, I do believe that actually Jesus is someone who can meet you there. He could meet you there because he was there the night before he died. I also believe that on the cross, when he dies, and we're told that even though it's in the daytime, the whole sky goes dark, and I think that's representing in part the fact that that Jesus isn't just dying a physical, painful death, but he's actually taking on himself everything. He's taking on the whole sin of the world. He's taking on all of our shame, all of the sin, and all of the suffering as well. I think in that moment, something far bigger than just the physical death of crucifixion, however excruciating that was, is taking place within Jesus. And I believe that includes all of these things as well, these kind of mental struggles that we experience. And if you ever cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you abandoned me? Where are you? That's a prayer Jesus prayed too. So I want to encourage you. I don't believe you're alone. I don't believe God is at a distance wanting to sympathize but unable to. I truly believe that he is with you. He's with you right now, that you're not alone, that no matter how dark it may seem, as I said, that the light has overcome the darkness. Jesus did it in the past, and I believe he can do it again in your life today. We believe in the resurrection, not just as a historical event, but something God does within us as Christians to actually bring us back to life in a new way now, to be new creations now, so that the old patterns and pathways, we don't have to be stuck in those forever, that there is hope for you, and God wants to offer you that tonight. And I'm praying that you will have the opportunity to receive that.
Yeah, I'm glad, Joe, that you brought up that verse when Jesus was in the garden. I've always thought it's one of the most remarkable verses in all of Scripture. My soul or my heart is overwhelmed with sorrow, even to the point of death. That sounds very familiar to those who have struggled with depression. Jesus sweat blood. That sounds very familiar to those who have dealt with anxiety. I think Jesus really does understand, and we actually have a friend who's a clinical psychologist and psychiatrist, and he told us recently of a young woman who came to him, and she had a long history of cutting herself, and they had their first meeting, and then at the end of the meeting, they were still deciding whether they would work with each other. She said, I just have one more question before I can decide whether or not you can work with me. And he said, what is it? And she rolled up her sleeve and she said, will you touch my scars? And he was sort of taken aback by that. And he asked why that was important to her. And she said, well, only if you're willing to reach out and actually cross a boundary and descend into my darkness with me, only then could I actually believe that I could trust you. And he didn't in that instant reach out and touch her scars. But what he did do was he told her that he knew someone who was able to do that in the most meaningful way. And over time, he's a Christian psychologist. He was able to explain something of the story of Jesus to her. And in particular, he explained about Thomas, who after Jesus had risen, he said, I'm not going to believe it unless I actually see the scars in Jesus's hands and in his side. And Jesus gave that gift to him. And when Thomas showed up and Jesus was there and he said, take your hand and put it here. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. It's very significant to the Christian faith that right now, post-resurrection, in his healed state, Jesus still carries his scars so that he can connect with those who are being scarred right now. And I think that Thomas finally knew that he could trust Jesus with his scars because Jesus was willing to trust Thomas with his scars. And he reached out and he put his hand there. And ultimately, this woman came to the conclusion that because of that, she could trust Jesus, and she wound up putting her faith in the person of Jesus because of how much he understood. And she said, this is a quote from her. She said, I know now that my scars likely will not disappear, but I have hope that one day they will bear the glory of the one who was scarred for me. Every one of us has scars. Do we know someone who deeply understands, who has been scarred themselves? And will our scars one day bear the glory of the one who was scarred for us? That would be my hope for you and for every one of us who's listening tonight, who do have scars and need to know there is someone who was scarred for us, who carries scars for us, and is willing to reach out and touch our scars and offer us life to the full. Thank you all.
Wow. Logan, Vince, Joe, thank you so much for joining us tonight and helping us think about this more clearly, more deeply. And I also want to just say thanks to those who ask questions. That is an amazing, vulnerable thing to do. And it really helped all of us by you asking those kinds of questions so that they could be spoken into as well, not just for your answer, but so that some of our hard answers could be reached as well. So thank you. Well, tonight we're giving away a free book to those of you who are not Christians. The book is Where is God in a Coronavirus World by John Lennox. Christians, we encourage you to read it, to buy it, get the audiobook, give it away. But please, this offer is for those who are still skeptical of Christianity. To receive the book, please go to the Contact Us page at noeticshift.org. That is noeticshift.org. And fill in the form with book in the comments section. For those of you who joined to watch and participate tonight, please join us next week at the same time and place as we continue our series. Our speaker will be Max Jagannathan, RZIM Asia Pacific Regional Director, and he'll be speaking about life in the marketplace post-pandemic. Well, please join us, invite others to this very important series on Where is God in the Coronavirus. And on behalf of both Noetic Shift and RZIM, I'm Conan Kublik. Thank you and good night.